Nothing could be more innocent than a teenager walking home from school in a small town surrounded by farms and friendly faces. You'd think that a routine stroll in a town where everybody knows everybody would be safe. Yet evil can pop out of the most unexpected places and strike without warning. And in this particular case from the early 1980s, you won't believe where things go as the truth begins to trickle out. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and true crime author. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. "13-year-old Sarah Rairdon was one of those kids who appreciated schoolwork and often stuck around after hours to work on extra credit projects she knew one day would pay her back. The discipline of being a good student, doing what you're supposed to do. That was Sarah Rairdon. On May 20, 1985, Sarah is at school finishing up one of those projects when she realizes it's close to 4 p.m. and time to get going on her way home. She's got a 4-mile walk in front of her, a walk which from time to time she did make on her own. Besides, Underwood, Minnesota was not a town inundated with danger or crime of any sort. Certainly not something the 330 residents ever thought about. In this area of Minnesota, about an hour and 10-minute drive southeast of more popular Fargo, North Dakota, not much of anything other than 4-H fairs, carnivals, and cow tipping took place. Underwood was known as a dairy farming community and popular vacation spot for area residents because of the dozens of lakes spread out in just about every direction you could look. Sarah is mostly content, according to friends. She is one of those kids whose name everybody knows. Kind, considerate, popular. Her dad, John Albert, has a dairy farm, working the land and stock daily, supplementing that income by fixing tractor tires around the region for a local company. Known as a fairly stand-up guy who could be seen playing basketball and fishing and swimming with his kids and their friends, John took pride in being able to sustain and take care of what was a very large family. John had divorced Sarah's mother in the early 1970s and took custody of the couple's 5 kids, Sarah being the only girl. Several years later, in 1975, John met a woman, Marilyn, who came into the relationship with 4 kids of her own before the newlyweds wound up having 2 kids together, bringing the large family unit up to a total of a whopping 11 kids. You look at the yard in the front of the Rairdon house on any given day, and it's obvious that 13 people lived there. Picnic tables and toys and barbecue grills and rusting cars without tires up on blocks, chickens and geese waltzing wildly around like they own the place. Even puppies, some neighbors said, could be seen at times bouncing up and down in the tall grass. You know, it was as though the Rairdon family were living the dream. That home economic project Sarah had been working on while at school on that May 20th day was coming along well. Sarah had worked hard to get on the 7th grade honor roll and maintain a place on the track and basketball teams. Staying busy in school and acing tests and setting herself up for high school in 2 years was Sarah's ticket out of small-town Minnesota and bigger dreams. And boy, did she have reason to leave this town. Walking east on County Road 122 toward her home on May 20th, Sarah makes pretty good time. Near 6:15 p.m., about halfway home, someone in town driving by Sarah stops and offers her a ride. She'd also been offered several rides leaving school. That's the type of town Underwood was. Neighbors watching out for each other. Sarah said a ride wasn't necessary, that her dad was supposed to pick her up, but he likely got tied up at work and would be coming any time now. Anyway, she'd be home soon enough, regardless. Sarah's thinking was right, because John Albert, her father, was about 1.5 miles away, fixing a tractor tire on a local farm. He'd worked as a farm tire repairman and could get called out. He left that tire repair job about 6:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Sarah had refused the ride from a kind neighbor. From there, John had to go back to the tire repair company office, which was about 20 minutes away from the area in which Sarah was seen walking. He then checked out of the company office at 7:30 p.m. and drove home. At the farm, with the bustling household of all those kids and schoolwork and chores, John Albert pulled in near 8 p.m. He asks where Sarah is. Apparently, he didn't run into her along the road, and by all accounts, she wasn't in the house. John's wife, Marilyn, says, "That's a good question." So she asks the other kids, all of whom report back that Sarah had not yet come home from school. By now, it's close to 10 p.m., and everyone is expressing concern. Sarah would have never stayed out past dark, and certainly not this late. She always came straight home.
So did the dad, John Rairdon, forget to pick her up after school, or what happened there? I know she'd told the neighbor she had a ride from her dad.
That is the beautiful voice of my executive producer, Catherine Law, who you hear from time to time on CTL, checking in and keeping me in check. Yes, I think, to answer your question. Or Sarah just assumed she'd run into Dad as he was heading back from that other job where he had been repairing farm tires. In any event, Sarah is nowhere to be found. Now it's late, and her stepmother and father are wondering what happened to her. Where in the hell could she have gone? These roads out here, they are not the type of roads a stranger or someone not from the area would stumble upon. These are backcountry roads residents of the town mainly use. The main road, where wary travelers and strangers generally pass through without noticing Underwood, was beyond the country road. I've been on these roads. Many of them are unpaved, gravel, and narrow, with acres and acres of farmland anywhere you look. At night, forget it. Dark as you'd expect, where predominantly street lights do not exist. Sarah's stepmom, Marilyn, stepsister, and stepbrother take one of the vehicles and drive out to the school, getting there just after 10 p.m. Not long after Marilyn and her kids head out looking for Sarah, John Albert leaves the house, telling everyone he is going out to look for his daughter as well. By midnight, they are all frantic. It just feels like something is off. By then, John Albert and Marilyn and the kids are back at home. And Sarah? Well, she's still missing. There had not been any trouble of a homicidal sort in this town since 1978, 7 years before. Crime just wasn't something residents ever, thought about. And yet, I will say, speaking from experience, this tends to be the moment when evil emerges and spreads its violent wings to swoop on in when you're least expecting it. That night, word began spreading that the Rairdons were searching for Sarah. Neighbors began coming out of their houses and looking for her too, offering to do whatever they could to help. The next morning, the community begins to organize, as Sarah is still nowhere to be found. John Albert is there leading the charge to find his daughter, directing people where to look and where they have already searched. Police show up too, and it feels like the entire town is now searching for Sarah. The congregation at the local Lutheran church steps up and gathers volunteers, while members of the congregation prepare meals for the Rairdon family and offer emotional support. This is a community effort. Everyone is involved. 2,500 flyers are soon printed and distributed. 150 people, half the number of people in that town, including some vacationers who have heard about the missing girl, join in and begin helping to search. Of course, local law enforcement is now involved on a larger level, but there seems to be no sign of Sarah. The grim reality is someone could have swiped Sarah off that country road, jumped back on the main route, and be halfway to California. There is no evidence, no crime scene, no witnesses other than that one woman and now several more who have since come forward who all say they saw Sarah and offered her a ride, but she refused. Well, those couple of days and nights turn into weeks. A $6,000 reward is raised by donations and offered for any information. Flyers with Sarah's photo are sent to police departments in all 50 states and even north into Canada. Still, nothing. In a town where crime is just not something anyone thinks or talks about, fear now begins to spread and grab hold of everyone. As the rumor mill is working overtime, had Sarah been abducted by some creep and taken far away for God knows what purpose? Let's take a break here. And when we return, we'll get right into the first big, incredible twist in this sad case. Stranger abductions of children are rare, despite what the general public thinks. In the mid-1980s, stranger abductions were almost non-existent. In 1984, for example, the FBI reported 67 cases of children being kidnapped by strangers. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported some 142 cases for that same year. So there's a discrepancy, but nonetheless, that's a low number. Yet as a nation then, we were in a constant state of fear of children being swiped off our streets by bad people driving around in dirty vans and cars. The Stranger Danger campaign had just been initiated by the American Medical Association. There were very high-profile abduction cases such as Adam Walsh and the Atlanta child murders being made into what I can recall were terrifying TV movies. Hollywood films such as Without a Trace dominated the box office. And this left the 1980s childhood marred in fear of you being the next victim of a man who wanted to do very bad things to you. I mean, let's just listen to a short clip from the Stranger Danger video that was on in the late 70s and early 80s.
You've taught your children to be polite and friendly, but have you taught them when not to be?
Hi there. Do you live around here?
Uh-huh.
You going to school?
Yes.
Well, I could give you a ride.
Last year, 50,000 children disappeared, many of them from nice, safe neighborhoods.
It's okay. Come on, hop in.
Talk to your children about not talking to strangers, and do it today. A message for your child's safety from the American Medical Association.
Terrifying, right? You think about being a kid and seeing that. You'd never leave the house. Author Philip Jenkins published I'd say a scholarly type of book in 1998 called Moral Panic: Changing Concepts of the Child Molester in Modern America, in which he talks about the widespread moral panic across America in the 80s. And here's a quote from that book. Between 1981 and 1985, federal hearings exposed the supposedly intertwined issues of child pornography and pedophilia, serial murder, and missing children, end quote. Adam Walsh's father, John Walsh, eventually became the host, as we know, of America's Most Wanted and co-founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. At a Senate hearing, Walsh claimed that every hour, 205 children in the U.S. were reported missing, which translated into almost 2 million children a year. Just wasn't true. But people believed it was. Of course, Walsh's case, like all of them, is a nightmare. We know what happened to Adam Walsh. He was decapitated by a pedophile. But the numbers were inflated mainly by including runaways in the data. That was the difference. One child kidnapped is too many, obviously, and the idea of a child being taken was a horror no parent ever wanted to face. We can all relate to that if, we're parents. And in Sarah Rairdon's case, as the weeks went on, it starts to look more and more like she is going to be included in that rare category, that small number of stranger danger abduction murders. They just cannot find any trace of this girl. Likewise, as in John Walsh's case, Sarah's dad, John Albert, became the mouthpiece and face of Sarah's disappearance. He appeared on television, making pleas for her safe return, and ended up becoming the leader of the group searching for his daughter. 7 weeks after Sarah disappears, on July 6, 1985, a Saturday, a farmer is out in one of his fields about 3 miles north of the town of Rothsay. And this is in Otter Tail County, Minnesota, which is about 25 miles from where Sarah went missing. Walking along, the farmer notices something interesting, that his cattle are purposely avoiding a certain area of the field. The grass there has not been touched by the cows. Authorities had not searched this area of the state for Sarah because it was so far away from where she was last seen. The farmer then walks out to the pasture where the tall grass is and looks down. And there it is. Skeletal remains of what he presumes is a young girl, simply because she is wearing a pink t-shirt with 2 teddy bears on the front. Same shirt, by the way, Sarah was reported wearing on the day she vanished. When the captain of the local PD goes out to take a look, he returns and he says, quote, "The clothing doesn't leave any question in our minds that it's her clothing," end quote. By Sunday, Sarah's family has officially identified her as being the victim in the field. Sarah was found near a dry culvert. Recent heavy rains over the past several weeks convince law enforcement that her body has washed down from an area up above where it was likely dumped by her killer. That discovery of Sarah's body confirms what law enforcement has been thinking all along, that she had not run away, but had met up with some sort of psychopath who took her for sadistic sexual purposes, and then he killed her. Sarah's family is obviously distraught. The worst possible outcome has come true. She leaves behind nearly a dozen siblings. Law enforcement gets to work. They now have a crime scene to process and evidence to submit. DNA was not yet part of the law enforcement box of tools and was in its infancy. But trace and fingerprint evidence can tell them a lot if the elements have not destroyed most, if not all, left behind. The point is here, they have stuff now that they can look at. They have evidence. They have a scene. They have, possible motive. So there's all kinds of elements of the crime they didn't have that now they have, and they can start an investigation. And they got a pretty good idea what's going on here. What they are certain of is that Sarah has been hit with a blunt instrument and stabbed in the abdomen. A horribly violent death. She bled out. Weeks after she is found, in August, nearly 3 months after Sarah vanished, John Albert sits on a panel with the Minnesota Attorney General to discuss missing children and sexual abuse. One would imagine to somehow deal with his grief and try to turn what happened into something that can help the community. The community embraces the grieving father. His family rally around him. Neighbors are at a loss regarding what they can do, consoling John Albert, who was 38 years old that summer. Sarah will never be forgotten. Most everyone in town makes that clear, and whoever abducted and killed her will be brought to justice. In remembering Sarah, neighbors come out and start to talk publicly. They say how much the girl just was happy all the time. She loved basketball, full of joy. This is someone the community is going to miss and mourn. Investigators are not discussing the case with the public, but they know that whoever grabbed Sarah and killed her is local. And when they talk about local, they mean within a few miles of where Sarah lived. The crime is too erratic and too unorganized for it to be committed by a serial offender of any sort or someone from out of town passing by, trolling for a young victim per se. After checking in with the local sex offenders and the like, they come up with nothing, mainly based on alibis and evidence. So they regroup and go back to square one and start to interview everyone Sarah knew, anyone she came into contact with the day she went missing, and anyone else they have a hunch could have been involved. One of Sarah's older brothers becomes a strong person of interest almost immediately as they start a second round of interviews. They question this kid. I imagine they poke a finger in his chest and, say, look, man, give it up. After checking his alibi and some additional investigation, there is absolutely no evidence to hold him. Fact is, he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder. As this is going on, detectives uncover a notebook Sarah was hiding at school. In it, she had written some rather strange yet revealing notes, one of which includes her pleading with an unnamed person not to kill her. So I can picture this kid in school in this notebook writing to herself, really, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. One of the Rairdon's neighbors then provides probably what is the most important piece of information to date. She claims that she and Sarah shared a tight, close bond and confided in each other. They often talked at length. She tells police that Sarah said she was being abused at home, that her relationship with her stepmom was contentious and hostile, and that some of her siblings would pick on her. So her home life wasn't quite the little house on the prairie image her family had led authorities to believe when they first started asking questions back in May. The neighbor even tells police that she called social services when Sarah once complained about her stepmom hitting her, but nothing was ever done. So detectives start bringing in the brothers and asking pointed, tough questions about what the hell's going on inside that household. And this is when the investigation opens right up. With all this going on, John Albert is still making plans to do more outreach in the realm of missing and exploited children. He's just finished that panel with the state Senate, and the response was good. He seems to be relishing in the public face he is putting to Sarah's case. Most everyone believes John is doing whatever he can to make sure Sarah is not just another forgotten victim of a violent sexual crime. As Sarah's brother sits and speaks with detectives, he brings up a name. John Albert, his stepfather. He's the one you should be questioning. It is no secret, seemingly so, inside the Rairdon house that John Albert has been sexually assaulting his daughter Sarah for a very long time. I'll be right back after a short break. I do these stories sometimes to point out that the worst evil we will ever meet up with in our lives is most likely right there inside our own homes, an arm's reach away. Most murders are committed by people the victim knows. That's just a fact. I think any true crime fan understands this. This is not some sort of big epiphany by me. But in many ways, I think we forget that the cruelest, darkest evil can be right there, staring right back at us. Let's get back into this case narrative and talk about this piece of shit scumbag who took Sarah's life, her own father. They bring in John Albert after his stepson mentions his name in August, and they ask, "Did you kill your daughter?" John admits right away that he has been sexually assaulting Sarah for years, but he says he did not kill her. I wasn't in the room at the time they interviewed John Albert, but I'm guessing the cops questioning him, after he responds that way, look at each other and kind of roll their eyes and say, "Stop the bullshit, John. It's time to give it up now. We got you." John then says, "I can't recall that day or what happened." He claims to have no memory of what happened on the day she went missing. So they keep questioning him. For the next several days, they don't let up. At one point, he says, It's possible that I killed her. Possible? Pushing him further, John Albert says this, that he could have killed Sarah, but he's not sure. That a vacant white farmhouse had something to do with the events of the day on which she disappeared. That he remembers driving in the area where she would have been walking home from school. That he did not kill her, but that his wife and stepson may have helped him dispose of the body. And finally, that he killed her and that there's a tire tool in his truck that might have blood on it. On August 14th, 1985, detectives prepare an arrest warrant after speaking with John several more times. They charge him with murder and sexual assault. In that warrant, John Albert admits that he made up the part about his wife and stepson helping him. Just wasn't true. So what does he actually admit to? Well, John explains to county deputies and state agents that he sexually assaulted his daughter Sarah at least 60 times, starting when she was 8 years old. Beginning in March 1985, Sarah says enough is enough and begins to resist his advances. On May 19, Sarah fights her father off. Then, the next day, as he is driving home, he sees Sarah walking, picks her up, drives her to a secluded area, and once again tries to sexually assault her. Well, she fights him off again. So John Albert takes an awl, which is a sharp-pointed steel tool used to punch holes in leather. We've all seen them. You got a big ball handle and then a long, pointy, sharp thing. And he has this in his truck, and he stabs her in the abdomen with it. Then he admits to striking her and watching as his daughter, Sarah, bleeds profusely to death. He then hides her body temporarily in a barn on the Rairdon property and goes back later that evening to dispose of Sarah in that farmer's field several miles away while his wife and stepson were out looking for her at the school. This is just a despicable human being. A piece of garbage the death penalty, in my opinion, is designed for. John Rairdon testifies in his own defense at trial, claiming he could not remember what he did on May 20th between leaving the tire repair job and arriving at his employer's office shop. He explains that even though he could not remember killing Sarah, he considered the possibility that he had after police suggested it to him because of the trust he had always put in police officers and his own guilt over the sexual abuse. So in other words, he's blaming the police. That's what he's doing here. He claims that during the investigation, he became convinced that he was the killer, and thus he created a narrative that satisfied investigators' demands, but that he later decided he could not plead guilty because he could not remember. He does admit on the stand that he sexually abused Sarah for a period of 5 years and that in the months before her death, she began to refuse his sexual advances. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury doesn't believe his bullshit and finds this scumbag guilty, and the judge serves him up a mandatory life sentence for first-degree murder, a 90-month consecutive sentence for first-degree sexual abuse, and a 50-month consecutive sentence for second-degree sexual abuse. He lost all of his appeals. Rairdon's wife, Marilyn, seems conflicted over the entire ordeal. She claims to have not known about the abuse or she would have stopped it and reported him. Social workers went in and interviewed all the kids and found, quote, no other instances of abuse. Ha! And we're going to believe social services now. But anyway, outside the court one day, talking to reporters, Marilyn says this: Sarah never told anyone. I wish that she had, because she paid for her silence with her life. Until next time, be safe, be aware. Credits for today's episode: John Albert Rairdon versus State of Minnesota, State Supreme Court Affidavit, December 12th, 1996. Father's arrest deepens a small-town mystery by E.R. Shipp, special to the New York Times, August 19, 1985. And Father in Court on Murder Count. That's an AP article, no byline, August 20th, 1985. Crossing the Line is produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Takaboom Productions. Written and executive produced by me, M. William Phelps, with Catherine Law. Audio mixing and mastering by Matt Russell.